South Africa does have a very complex history when it comes to LGBTQIA rights. While the country boasts these progressive laws, social attitudes can vary very greatly. Today, we're joined by a representative from the Other Foundation, an organization which is dedicated to advancing equality and freedom for the LGBTQ people in South Africa. And today we're speaking with Samuel Shapiro. So this is the Other Foundation's Programs Processes Officer, here to fill us in on the specifics of the work of the Other Foundation. How are you doing today?
I'm doing really well. How are you?
Doing very well. We're glad to have you on the show.
Thank you.
So thank you very much, Samuel, for availing yourself to do this interview. So if you can also just tell us a little bit more about the foundation story of the Other Foundation, how it got established and the inspiration behind it, and also what motivated the creation of this organization.
Absolutely. I would like to just start that we are not a South African organization. We're from we work in Southern Africa. So we work in 13 of the Southern African countries. We very much see the challenge not as a South African challenge, but as a regional challenge, as a global challenge. The Other Foundation was started formally back in 2013, 2014, very much as a response to a shrinking of funding for LGBT activists and advocacy, and at a time where there were quite big shifts happening. So we define this area as being very much on a knife edge of progressive laws, homophobic, transphobic laws being taken off the books in many of the countries who have now decriminalized, and the momentum needing to continue. And so as that funding space was shrinking, there was a need for a local African funder to step in and occupy that space and essentially open up new avenues of funding for activists and advocacy to happen. We're not just a funding organization, though. We consider ourselves a community foundation, which means from our board of trustees to our team to have peer reviewers, the people who look at the grants, everyone is part of the community. They're the activists who work in the community. So we work together in order to advance the rights of LGBTI people in the region. And we've now been doing it since our first grants were given in 2014. So it's been 10 years of us doing this work. And we've seen a lot of further advances where laws are changing, attitudes are changing, but also backlash. More visibility means more people that are homophobic, more people who are transphobic are enacting violence, are enacting backlash against our community, as is the nature when you push for these things. One just last thing is we're very adamant about correcting misconceptions. So for instance, that Africa is homophobic, Africa is transphobic. We do a lot of research to show that that isn't a very homogenous opinion, that there's actually a lot more progressive values in Africa than is essentially put onto us. And in South Africa particularly, although there are, like you said in the introduction, there are still murders happening. There's still homophobia. There's still transphobia. There's a much bigger population of people who are supportive of LGBTI rights, people's rights. And there's also a large group of people in the middle who are on the fence. And a lot of the work advocates do in South Africa is targeting those people, specifically to change attitudes. And yeah, I'll speak you're focused on South Africa, so I'll speak to South Africa, but regionally that's different in different countries. There isn't an homogenous sort of movement. There isn't an homogenous backlash either. It's complicated. It's diverse. And people generally need the narrative change that's taking place is needed, because the opinions and the beliefs of LGBTI people I'm happily to say it, are quite wrong. And they're misconceptions. And the community we work with are aimed at changing that.
Well, yeah, that's very admirable work, and also just absolutely necessary. as we're like moving forward in society. But I'm really curious about how I want to go deeper into that. And so I want to know more about some of the like research projects that you all have worked on, like the Progressive Prudes Project. And if you could share some insights from this research on public perceptions of LGBTQIA communities that you guys have been enlightened on.
Yeah, so really what happened was for years, decades even, a lot of the research was based around LGBTI people's experiences, which is good research. It helps us target advocacy, target policy changes. But what there wasn't was a very comprehensive research on the attitudes of the general public. And so we aim to do this research for two purposes. One, to just like undo the opinion that people in this country are homophobic and transphobic, and that's a generalized opinion, but also to reframe the way the questions are asked. For a long time, the way questions about LGBTI people is asked are very leading. Do you think sexual relations between two men is disgusting? It's not a value-based question. And so we shifted the questionnaire, we shifted the way we asked the questions to understand what people's values were, where they came from, how they believed it. And what we got was, although there are homophobic and transphobic attitudes, we also got huge amounts of people saying how they value community, they value diversity, they value welcoming people who are different. And that kind of, those answers allow us to help not just us as the Other Foundation, but the entire LGBTI community and the activists shift the narrative, so that instead of saying, for instance, LGBTI people are here and you have to, and we're here and we're proud and we have to deal with it, we were able to say LGBTI people are families. We have families, we're part of families. LGBTI people are African. We live in Africa. We're part of Africa. A lot of research has now been done around looking through language and showing that through language we can identify that LGBTI people were part of the community, have been part of African communities for centuries. I don't want to dispel that there's still homophobia and transphobia and those things, but that it's a lot more nuanced. Also about Christianity, right? We countering that being LGBTI is anti-Christian. For decades since the 90s, LGBTI people have been cast into pathology, whether it's HIV/AIDS or transgender healthcare. It's been seen as a sickness, and we wanted to use the research to dispel those narratives and build a new narrative that very much around Ubuntu, that we are the community that we surround ourselves with, and that LGBTI people are part of our communities. And if we narrative to people that LGBTI people are equally fighting for education, for housing, for justice, it allows people, and the movable middle I spoke about, which is a good 30 to 40% of the population, to see LGBTI people as part of the community and not what was in people's minds before as a Western construct or an elite construct, but very much centered in our communities.
Definitely, and you still tune into Sakhisizwe, Building the Nation, Bodinasi. We are speaking to Samuel from the Other Foundation. So do engage with us, 061-862-1065. Samuel, so as you work on the Southern Africa and looking at Southern Africa as a diverse population with various cultures and religion backgrounds, how does the Other Foundation address the influence of these factors on public perceptions when it comes to the LGBTIQ plus community?
Multitude of narratives. So the narrative in a place like Namibia is going to be different to a narrative in South Africa. And to give a detailed example of that, right now in Namibia, they're going through a massive backlash because big wins have been had for the LGBTI community there, changing laws, but there's a big backlash. And that backlash has led to murders, people dying, people being harassed. And so there we want the narrative to very much as an anti-violence narrative, asking the churches to be against violence, even if they're not going to become fully supportive of the movement, being against violence is an easy, low-hanging fruit. In South Africa, being against murders of lesbian women is something that everybody agrees to. Our research shows that 90+% of the population disagrees with violence to people who are different. When you go to places, for instance, like Eswatini, the narrative there shifts a little bit because they have a massive democratic movement that's taking place there. And to talk about LGBTI people's rights outside of what is a push for democracy isn't the best approach. And activists are seeing that the best approach is to work within the democratic movement, fighting for democracy. In Zimbabwe, with the shift of regimes, comes from the Mugabe regime, who was very vocally anti-LGBTI, to one who isn't as vocal but not really doing anything about it. We need to shift the narrative of how we talk to it. And I could go literally through each and every country, but having those narratives being adapted to the context that they're in is vitally important. In order to shift people's mindsets, because laws and changes are great and they do help, and we've seen how they help, but attitudes is by far the biggest shift and change we're looking for.
I really love the approach that you're taking with the question asking and the sparking up of dialogue as it relates to queer communities, considering, the different cultural trends. I could go into it, but I am curious if you could specify what are some of the biggest challenges facing the LGBTQIA community in South Africa specifically that you have noticed today with your work.
So all right, and I don't want to. I'll give you examples, but that is in no way meant to take away from other people's struggles. But the violence meted out towards lesbian women is rife, and it continues. And loads of organizations are working with it, either within GBV or within LGBTI movement. But the discrimination and violence and ultimately murders that are happening are a big priority in South Africa. There's also the silence, the advocacy silence, but also the community silence around intersex people. There's still laws that prevent intersex people from accessing healthcare. There's still laws that prevent intersex people from not essentially being mutilated when they're children. But a number of intersex is a very silenced community in our country. And very little research is actually done on intersex people, even though what research is done shows there's a lot of support towards protecting and helping intersex people. But also trans people, transgender people. There's laws that are there for gender recognition and healthcare, but the actual healthcare providers, the actual administration of all of these is sorely lacking and sorely disappointing. And all of that meted out that the violence towards transgender women specifically, but also transgender people in general, but specifically to women, is incredibly high. As well as bullying in schools. Recent changes to the curriculum that sort of try to incorporate transgender people into it, not even transgender people's issues, but just transgender people into it, has been met with a vast amount of backlash. And so there's these spaces of advocacy and action that, because of our constitution, because of our laws, often get sort of wiped over. And so pushing for real change in the community to the lived experience of LGBTI people is the main push in South Africa at the moment.
Thank you very much, Samuel, for taking the time to speak to us today. Samuel, so just in conclusion, before we wrap up, if people want to have a conversation, to want to know a little bit more, or even invest or donate towards the work that you are doing, how do they go about?
So, I'll say three things. Our website is incredibly useful. It has our research. It has a place to donate. We have a Million Ones campaign, which is hosting dinners to raise money from people. But you can find that all on our website. All of our details are on our website. Our grants will be opening. Our call for grants will be opening probably around July, August. So sign up to our mailing list and you'll get all those updates.
And then,
the website is just theotherfoundation.org.
Awesome stuff. And then just looking ahead, like what are some of the other foundation's long-term goals for achieving greater equality and freedom for the LGBTIQ plus community?
Right now, our strategy is very much twofold. We want to increase the power of the lesbian, transgender, and intersex movements. We see them as being fundamentally needed in order to push for the rights of all people. But also to open up more avenues of funding, open up more avenues of resources, open up more avenues of networking so that the movement is capacitated to really make sure that the change that happens doesn't go backwards.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, yes, time is always been my personal worst enemy, but I do not want to end this conversation, but unfortunately that's what time permits. But before we go, do you have any concluding words for our listeners? Yeah.
No, I mean, join us, join our social media, follow activists, follow the community, see what actions. June is coming up, which is a big time for prides. Just get involved as much as possible in whatever capacity you can get involved in. But I do thank you for the time as well.
Can you actually name the social media handle that people can follow?
The Other Foundation. On Facebook, we're the most prominent, but just The Other Foundation.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. It was wonderful to have you on the show, and I hope that we can have you again in the future.
Anytime. It's a pleasure.
Okay. Have a good one. Goodbye.
Cheers.
So that was Samuel Shapiro of the Other Foundation, who gave us a bit of insight into the incredible work that they are doing, the way that they are opening up avenues for discourse, meaningful discourse about the LGBTQ community in Southern Africa, and giving us some specific insights into the challenges faced by queer communities in Southern Africa and South Africa specifically. I learned so much, and I wish we could talk forever, but unfortunately we can't. So we are moving on into the 1 o'clock news, where
Isobusi. So we're going to go into the sounds by PJ Morton featuring P Prime, called Please Be Good to Me, and that should be taking us to the isiXhosa news at 1 o'clock.